You can add me to the list of people who cried at the end of the book.
All right, you're on the list.
This is We Bleed Orange and Black, the podcast for Halloween and horror lovers. Join us as we interview creators, discuss our favorite horrors, and share original spooky stories. I'm Jeff C. Carter, and this week we're talking with Daniel Kraus about his new book, WHALEFALL, available August 8th. Daniel Kraus is a New York Times bestselling author, as well as the co-author of The Shape of Water and Troll Hunters with Guillermo del Toro and The Living Dead with George A. Romero. He's won countless awards and accolades, spanning the spectrum from scary middle grade fiction and fantasy to adult sci-fi, crime, and horror, in prose, graphic novels, film, and television. Daniel's work has been translated into over 20 languages. He lives with his wife in Chicago, but you can visit him at danielkraus.com. Welcome to the show, Daniel.
Thank you for having me.
Here is an icebreaker question. Which is more frightening, outer space or the deep sea?
Well, that's a good one. I think the deep sea is probably a little more frightening. In outer space, you're sort of surrounded by nothing, where in deep sea, you're surrounded by nothing, but it's under so many pounds of pressure that your physical body couldn't even exist in it. You could kind of, I guess, float through space to some degree inside of a spacesuit, but a diving suit's not going to protect you beneath the sea. You'll be smashed to smithereens. Plus, if we're dealing with our galaxy, we sort of know what's out there, whereas in the deep sea, we have no clue what's down there, really. The sea is a far more unknown quantity than space.
I think that's a good answer. Can you tell us a bit about yourself?
I'm a novelist generally. I've done a little bit of TV and film writing, but mostly I write novels. Whalefall is, I think, my 21st book. That's if you're counting graphic novels, of which I've published 3, I believe. So yeah, I write a lot. I write for all age levels. I guess I haven't written any picture books for the preschool set yet, but I've written for middle school or a little younger, high school and adults. And generally it either has to do with horror or something that's kind of horror adjacent. But within that bubble, I mix it up quite a bit. I go out of my comfort zone and my genre zone a lot more than I think most authors do. Not necessarily always for my benefit.
Is it that you're going out of your comfort zone or that you just have a very wide comfort zone?
Yeah, that's actually well said. It's the latter. I have a wide comfort zone. Yeah, there's a kind of a perceived comfort zone where people think is sort of down the middle, mainstream Daniel Kraus. I think I could look at my books and sort of identify the ones that might fit in that lane, but I'm very unsatisfied with that lane, with staying in it. So I'm constantly going out trying different things, and that's why I end up writing in different formats and for different age ranges and in entirely different styles. I don't think it's always useful from a commercial point of view, but it's keeping me interested in what I'm doing.
Do you have an approach to story that straddles all these different forms, genres, age ranges? Is there a way you cleave to the heart of the story and it doesn't matter if it's a graphic novel or a middle grade horror fiction? Or do you have to start from scratch when you're jumping into something like YA?
I think I was definitely developing a sort of method to apply to everything. And so the second half of my career has been basically trying to throw that out as much as possible. I don't want to rely upon a method. After a while, you get kind of comfortable. You kind of figure it out. You figure out how you write a book, what works best for you. And after 6 or 7 books, I started to get a little concerned that it was, I would never call a book easy, but it was feeling like I was too comfortable with the process. And so now with almost every book, I try something that's completely out of whack for me, something that I haven't done before. whether it's a genre I haven't worked in before, or a perspective that's really unusual, or a prose style that's unusual. I'm trying to always create problems for myself. So it feels like I'm writing for the first time every time.
You mentioned that many of the genres you touch upon are at least horror adjacent. What got you into horror?
Most of my books that people would call horror don't involve the supernatural at all. Some do. As you know, you write 21 books, you're going to dip into that at some point. But when I say horror, I mean it in a very broad sense. There's usually horrifying things happening. I've been interested in that from the very beginning. Rarely an interview goes by that I don't mention that I got into Night of the Living Dead when I was about 5 years old. My mom was just a big fan of it. That and Twilight Zone. Those were two things, because they were on all the time, that I could really latch on to as a kid. And because they were advanced entertainment, even for adult entertainment, they never really got old. They kind of grew up with me, which is a sign of good art. The Night of the Living Dead I saw when I was 5 is not the same one that I saw when I was 12 or 25 or 45. It reveals new things about itself and you as you get older. So I was always really into that. Specifically, I was interested in my response to horror. Like, that's always been a real guiding light for me growing up, and sometimes in a really negative way and sometimes in a positive way. There were years growing up where I couldn't watch horror movies at all. They made me physically sick. I got really scared by them. And then times where I was just a Fangoria reading nerd about it. So, and it really fluctuates, and it still fluctuates to some degree. I'm maybe less concerned with horror than I am transgressive material. Like, I'm really interested in pushing boundaries a little bit and seeing what my own comfort levels are with certain boundaries. And that's something I really have been interested in all my life. Even as a little kid, I was always seeing how far I could go, how much I could scare myself or make myself uncomfortable before I kind of had to run away. And then I'd come back and kind of test myself again. I'm still kind of in that pattern.
That's a very interesting approach to horror. I wouldn't call it introspective, more like self reflective. You're watching yourself watch horror or get scared. I can see how that translates into writing horror and working across a spectrum of genres very well, because you're always keeping your finger on the reaction that you're creating. I know that's a popular rule of thumb when it comes to writing, is it's all about the reader's reactions.
Yeah.
So you mentioned that you work in graphic novels. How did you break into that, and what has that process been like?
Well, it's all pretty recent. I didn't grow up with comic books at all, so I don't have any background in comics. I don't have any nostalgia for any comic book characters. That just wasn't part of my growing up. I turned to it sort of out of curiosity and because I had a certain project that I thought would work as a graphic novel. It was an idea called the autumnal that I couldn't quite figure out. As most of my ideas in other formats, they began as book ideas and then they didn't work. And this was an idea that I tried as a book a few times and never really got more than a few pages, and it just didn't work at all. But it was very visual in a lot of ways, so I thought maybe this would make a good comic. I didn't know anything about comics, of course, but got in touch with, and maybe they got in touch with me. I always forget how we got introduced to each other, but I ended up doing it with Vault Comics, and it was just a really great experience. I've worked relatively steadily in comics, and then they get bound as graphic novels. And I've heard lots of horror stories from my comic writing friends and like famous authors who tried to get into comics. It was just total disasters. For whatever reason, I took to it really quickly. Like, it made sense to my brain right away. It was just a really good palate cleanser between novels too. It's a totally different kind of brain function. I assume I will continue to do that.
I hope you do. I read the autumnal. It was excellent, and I can't imagine it in any other format. It is a folk horror set in a small New England town, and the idea of autumn and trees and falling leaves is so critical to the atmosphere that I'm sure you could paint a beautiful picture with words and put it all in prose, but really seeing those orange-drenched pages are what create an atmosphere in the book.
And you know, part of it, and I hadn't really thought of it this way until just now, but I wonder if part of it was just that I felt I needed help. The story wasn't working, and I don't really know how else to reach out for help in that way. I don't have a writing group or beta readers or that. But I wonder if part of me was like, I need a team on this because I can't figure it out myself. And then, once the artist, who's Chris Sheehan in this case, starts drawing it, the main two characters became two of my favorite characters I've ever written because suddenly they had faces and they were somehow interpreted through someone else's lens, which made them feel more human to me and removed in a kind of interesting way. Like normally I have no compunctions, but putting my characters under duress. But in this case, I felt more sympathy for them. I knew what was coming for these characters, and I didn't know that I would suddenly like them so much now that they were visualized. It was a really cool experience.
It's interesting that you say that you don't usually ask for help because I see that you collaborate with a lot of people on a lot of projects. You've collaborated with directors and doctors and whale scientists.
Yeah, I mean that's a good point. I mean, my collaborations, I've only had one really standard collaboration. That's with Lacey Harrison, who I'm doing a middle grade series called The Graveyard Girls. All the other collaborations have been unusual in some way. They don't follow what you're imagining. Think of two writers writing a novel together. They're much more idiosyncratic than that. But yeah, I have done several collaborations, partially because of what I said earlier, that I want new challenges and collaborations that intrinsically bring a sort of friction, but that's what I'm looking for. I want there to be differences in opinion. I want there to be ideas I'm unfamiliar with or maybe even uncomfortable with. My book with Dr. Sharon Moalim is a great example. I mean, he's this brilliant geneticist. For the book we wrote called Wrath, constantly throwing all these advanced science concepts at me, which is something way beyond my natural ability to understand, but I had to work through it. And of course, Whalefall isn't a collaboration, but as you mentioned, it did involve a lot of firsthand research. I read books, but most of my research was just talking to people on the phone or on Zoom. So in that sense, it was really navigating person to person, unfamiliar topics.
Is there anyone from any field that you have not yet collaborated with that is on your bucket list?
Gosh, I mean, it would have been George Romero. I mean, he was my hero of heroes, and the fact that I got to collaborate with him is still something I cannot really comprehend. Beyond him, I don't know. None of my collaborations have been ones that I've gone searching for. I've stumbled upon every single one in bizarre ways. So I don't really have a list. There's not really anyone who's in my sights to collaborate with, but there never was. Romero would have been on that list had I thought it was remotely possible. So who knows what will happen next.
Speaking of collaborating with whale scientists, let's get into your new book, Whalefall. Whalefall is loglined as The Martian meets 127 hours in a scientifically accurate thriller about a scuba diver who's been swallowed by an 80-foot, 60-ton sperm whale and has only 1 hour to escape before his oxygen runs out. You cover this a bit in the afterwards, but can you give us a brief summary of how this project came about? What was your inspiration for Whalefall?
Yeah, it's rare that I can tell you the exact date of a book idea, but I can. But basically, I was hanging out in December of 2020 with a couple of friends. It was at night. We were at Lake Michigan. I live in Chicago. And they were talking about a viral video of a couple of kayakers who end up in a whale's mouth. So a whale suddenly breaches and they're in the mouth. And they had both seen it and I hadn't. And their excitement over the video got me thinking almost immediately. I thought, I wonder if anyone's ever taken that idea seriously about being swallowed by a whale. Of course, it's been taken metaphorically many times. Book of Jonah, Pinocchio, Arthur C. Clarke's Childhood's End, which is amazing. But no one's ever really tackled it seriously. And I didn't even know if it was legitimately possible. So I thought about that just kind of to myself all night. And then the next morning, I started reaching out. I'll spare you the details. You can read the afterword. But essentially, to cut to the chase, I connected with various whale scientists who confirmed to me that although it had probably never happened, it was theoretically possible if it were a giant sperm whale. It's the only whale that has a throat that could possibly even get close to swallowing a human. Other whale throats are tiny. I mean, they're like soup cans width. So every time you see a headline that says kayaker or swimmer swallowed by a whale, they're all lies. They're getting mouthed by whales. Like those whales can't swallow anyone. I'm not saying it wouldn't be terrifying, because of course it would be. So that's what I started doing. I didn't know anything about whales, of course, or diving. I'm not a diver. I'm not a swimmer. I'm not a scientist. So this was truly almost as if I were in the stomach, kind of pointing my flashlight at certain things and saying, what's over here? What's over there? And the scientist kind of explaining what was going on in there. And then I would start asking questions. I was like, well, what happens if you go this way? What's over there? What happens if you go to the second stomach? What happens if you try to go into the throat? And slowly, piece by piece, I began through them learning what was possible inside a whale and what wasn't, and what the environment was like, and what you might be able to hold on to or pick up. Over a few months, that's how the plot came together. All these little wrong turn, weird ideas I would have. And the scientists really got into it. They were very excited by the idea. When I pushed them, they would come up with really amazing ideas that I don't think any of us saw coming. And they would say something, and then I'd add to it. And I said, well, if you said the diver could do this, what if he did this? And then they would say, yes, I never thought about that, but he could if he did X, Y, and Z. So anyway, it was a long, arduous process, but we did. Finally, I came up with what would happen during those 60 minutes inside the whale.
Did the realization of how much research and preparation you would have to do in order to do this properly, did that give you any pause?
I got so deep in it so quickly that I didn't really have time to have pause. And I was so sure that the idea was a winner that I just didn't ever really doubt it. And generally, like, they were good teachers, the scientists, and I generally learned okay. There were a few spots here and there that I really got hung up. I spoke for hours on phone calls and Zoom calls with one of the scientists to try to figure out a whale larynx. For some reason, this body part gave me so much trouble, and it's important to the book. Lots of those body parts are. We would get on Zooms, and she would hold up mummified or preserved whale larynxes. I'd hold up visual aids of my own, and we try to work through it. I had this book for scientists, so it just has a bunch of like inside views of whales guts, and we'd look at that. And there were moments where I felt like I was never going to figure something out. It really was like being in a specialized class. Like, I had signed up for a advanced whale biology class, and I just had to hang in there as much as possible. And I could always call on the experts to help me out. And so there are a few parts in the book in earlier drafts where I would just skip a few pages ahead, and I would just kind of put in brackets, figure this out with the scientists later, because I wanted to keep the momentum going of writing. But there were always little things. Suddenly realize, oh, I'm going to need a jellyfish expert. So I'm going to need to find one of those. Or lots of other kind of experts that I can't mention or it'll spoil it.
I once read an article about happiness, and it basically said that one of the best things you can do to achieve happiness is to learn how to scuba dive. Because you enter a new world and open new vistas. I have inner ear issues, so I can't dive. And I always thought that was kind of a bummer until I read your book. And now I'm glad I'm never going to scuba dive. But you learned to scuba dive just for the book?
Yes. I'm not a swimmer really, so it wasn't something I was like super excited to do. It was not on my list of things I wanted to learn. But yeah, I mean, my character spends the entire book in a wetsuit strapped into scuba gear. So there wasn't really too many options for me. If I wanted to know what it felt like, sounded like, and all that stuff, I was going to have to scuba dive. So I learned, and not to depress you, it was kind of amazing. We're so used to the idea that scuba technology exists that we forget, or I forgot, how miraculous it is. I mean, you're breathing underwater. It's that simple. This first couple breaths you take on the water are a little scary because your part of your brain is just certain you're going to breathe in water. But when you don't, it's amazing. And really, for a non-swimmer like me, it's the ideal thing to do in a body of water because you don't need to be a swimmer to be a scuba. Your BCD, your vest you wear, it's doing kind of all the work. The trigger, you're going up and down. It's doing all that magical work for you. So really, you're just sort of steering. You're almost like a submersible that you're steering with a joystick. I understand now why people get so excited about it. It is otherworldly. It does kind of change your perspective on things.
You had mentioned physical restrictions about certain whales, about how their throats were as narrow as a soup can. Even a sperm whale still has a very narrow throat.
Right.
Likely that dictated the size of your protagonist. It had to be a skinny person, a rail-thin person, especially since they had a scuba tank on. How much of the character came from the limitations of needing to be in a whale?
Yeah.
The fact that he was very reedy and very small and underdeveloped and weak, but had a larger-than-life father.
Hmm.
How much of that was determined by the setting and the setup, or were there certain things that started character first?
I love that question because I think about that a lot with characters, how their physical reality affects their personalities. It's a really basic way I construct characters that I have forgotten that that's what I do, but that's what I do. So in this case, it really was part of it. So my first thought when coming up with the idea was maybe this diver's a teenager. So if it's a skinny teen, I wonder if they would have a complex about that, and I wonder who would be giving them a hard time about it. And right there, you start developing the central relationship in the book because one of the ongoing issues between the diver and his father is that the son, the diver's never quite masculine enough. Like he's not big enough, he's not tough enough. He cries when his dad thinks he's too old to cry. He wants to hang out with his mom and his sisters at the water park instead of going to the real water park, the ocean. So there's all these like little digs that make him feel lesser than. And that all really has its foundation in the physical realities of what the diver needs to look like to fit into the throat.
You have this metaphorical precursor of the book of Jonah. You mention a quote, truth never outweighs mercy, and the book is broken into two parts, truth and mercy. What was the thinking behind that?
Yeah, sometimes a book, everything just works, everything clicks into place. And that was something that, just from my own sort of reading of Jonah, seemed to be a message that then seemed to fit really perfectly into the story where you have these two characters, Jay, the diver, and Mitt, his father. And there's a whole lot of truths that back up their relationship, a lot of things that they did to each other that aren't good. He treated his son badly. And then when the dad became sick and was dying, the son wouldn't come visit him as he was dying. So there were a lot of facts. And if judging by strictly the facts, it's hard to fault Jay for much of what he did because his dad was terrible to him. But I don't know that when it comes down to it, and this is really one of the big things that the book gets at, and I don't know how I feel about it. Like I don't have all the answers here, but something that makes me think about is at the end of the day, do you really want the facts alone to be the final word? Can we be better than the facts would lead us to be? The second half of the book, entirely inside the whale, which is about kind of this reconciliation between the father and the son, is a question of whether they can show each other mercy despite what they've done to each other. Even talking about it now, I get a little chills because it's just it's a great question, and it's a troubling question in some ways, and it's an inspiring one in other ways. I feel like this is just a perfect book to put it into.
You mentioned that you don't have a lot of beta readers, but I'm sure this has been through a lot of edits and things like that. I'm sure friends and family have weighed in on this. Is there a consensus about how people feel about Mitt or Jay and their relationship?
I don't think there's a consensus. Not that many people have read it that I have spoken to in depth. Most of my readers were reading for technical reasons, reading for whale facts, they were reading for diving accuracy. My editor, of course, was reading for all sorts of things. And I know a lot of people out there have read advanced copies, but I'm not having like intensive dialogue with them about it. So I don't really know how they feel about it. I know that a lot of people, when they get to the end, are reporting that they're crying. So I think that I don't know that even they would know where they come down. I think the effort toward it that Jay makes and Mitt as the whale makes is moving. Like whether or not it's successful is less important than that they tried.
You can add me to the list of people who cried at the end of the book.
All right, you're on the list.
May I ask a personal question?
Yes.
And we can cut this out 100%. Does this book reflect your own experience with family relationships?
Uh, I think yes, in some ways. It's that's always a difficult question because every book is going to reflect a certain degree of real feelings and relationships in some way. It's never a one to one. My dad is certainly not Mitt. What he does share with them, he wasn't a man of the sea, but he is a hunter, which isn't something I really picked up. In that one sense, there is some similarity. The message of the book is really less of who screwed up doing what to whom. It's really a more people screw up and people try to make amends the way they can. It's no good at the end of the day. It's not good for your soul to hang on to too many slights and too many bad feelings. Everyone has to live their life. I mean, there are exceptions, of course. There are things that are unforgivable. I think largely for a lot of us, we have to move past things. We have to accept people as humans. People generally live for quite a while, and they're going to make mistakes. They're going to screw people up. So that's not a direct answer, but there's pieces of me certainly in this book, and I think there's more pieces of me in this book than there are in any of my other books. But that said, there's things in the book that feel like they're from my life, but really aren't. For example, the character in the book has two sisters, one who's a speech pathologist and one who's a chemical engineer. And I have two sisters, one's a speech pathologist. It's totally not based on. That's an example of something that looks like it's something real, but it's totally happenstance. He has two sisters, to make an analogy to something in the book of Jonah, and I needed him to have certain bits of knowledge that I got from my real sisters, and so I didn't know how he'd get those. So I put those pieces of knowledge in the character's sisters. So it's always dangerous to look at a piece of work and think that you know really what the artist is up to, what the writer is up to, what he's really basing this on, because it's really a mix of real people, real things, and complete fabrications.
That is a great example of how you are able to load this technical story about scientifically accurate problems in anatomy and gas mixtures. There's a million things that go into this story, but every bit of information is influenced by his personal relationship with the person he is receiving this information from.
Exactly, yeah. Like there's some information he doesn't want to hear or he won't hear. That was the big challenge and the big promise of the book to me, was that I could do this technical procedural and load every bit of it with as much emotion as possible, and that every piece of information is going to be complicated by some emotion behind it.
Well, that's amazing how you have a Crichton-esque level of info dump and it's all emotional.
Yeah, thank you.
May I ask another personal question?
Yes.
I saw that you mentioned online that your sister was undergoing a procedure.
Yes.
How is she doing?
Okay. I mean, I'm not there, so I don't know the day to day, but I think things could be better. They could be worse. And there's a lot of questions yet. So I don't really know.
You mentioned something in that post that I thought was incredibly moving. You said, I'm not one for prayers, but I do believe in finding solace in parts of our world that are unfathomable and enduring.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not a religious person, but I write about religion constantly. I'm fascinated by it. I think for those of us who aren't religious, it's easy to sort of envy the person who has this sort of lattice work of beliefs that fall back on. But a lot of what the character of Mitt is all about is he's someone who's very kind of aggressive toward religion. He doesn't trust it, he doesn't like it at all, but he's an extremely spiritual guy. I don't think he really realizes it, but he's covered with these tattoos that are his version of wearing like a crucifix or rosary beads. Like he's covered with symbols of his own religion. He finds God in a sperm whale, in a giant squid, in the endless expanse of the ocean. So when he starts this sort of whale watching business that he forces Jay to help him with, he talks about how his job is really just to serve up the emotion of awe to these tourists, because some of them might consider themselves religious people, but they've lost their ability to feel awe, which I think to my mind means to feel small. I think paradoxically, when we feel small, that allows us to feel the presence of something big. That's why I think people like giant ornate churches, because in there they feel sort of dwarfed by something bigger. I would say you don't need a church. If you went out on the ocean, there's nothing bigger than that. It is the biggest thing there is. And these giant creatures that swim in there, they are truly unfathomable. The sperm whale is potentially the strangest, most esoteric, bizarre creature on Earth. Even among whales, they don't make any sense. Just look at them. These giant heads, these tiny jaws, and filled with this oil. They don't make any sense whatsoever. They are aliens down there that are almost as curious as angels would be in the sky. So I think a way to process difficult things in your life, I do believe that turning to nature makes a lot of sense to me. I think there's a lot of solace to be had seeing trees that are hundreds of years old and saying, well, I am temporary. We are all extremely temporary.
Well said. I like that. I just want to sit with that for a second.
Yeah.
All right. Now I have a naughty question.
All right.
Are there plans to adapt WHALEFALL to any mediums besides beer?
Yes, there's a whale beer, and there's actually going to be a whale something else too, but I can't talk. It's not beer, but it's in the neighborhood. You'll see what it is. Beyond that, as far as like other media, as you would probably guess, I cannot speak on this matter currently, and when I'm able to speak about anything, I will do so.
All right, we will stay tuned. Can we wrap it up with a Halloween question?
Oh, please.
You have two projects, the Autumnal and Blood Sugar, that focus on autumn and the Halloween season. Is this a favorite topic of yours?
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, it is my favorite holiday, as you might expect. It's the most fun holiday. It subsumes the whole month. I'm not big on holidays in general, but I certainly don't devote a whole month to them. Where I certainly do to Halloween. Blood Sugar is one of my favorite books that I've read. One of my top 2 or 3, and it's based on the old urban legend of someone putting poison in razor blades and candy. And I love that. I love the danger of Halloween, that it kind of rides that edge between fun, put on a little plastic mask, danger, which is just not danger at all, and some actual kind of scary things threaded in there. You know, the whole idea of trick or treating is bonkers. Like, if that didn't exist, there's no way we would let that happen today. So yes, I love it. I love to write about it. I'll probably write about it again.
Every once in a while, someone will hit me with a take on trick or treating I hadn't considered. The idea that in 2023, if people try to start trick or treating, they'd be like, hell no.
Yeah, it's like the worst idea ever.
It really harkens back to a simpler time. That is amazing. Where can our listeners find you online?
DanielKraus.com is really the main point of contact. Through the month of August and September, I will be posting a lot on Twitter as I go on tour. So lots of fun stuff there, I'm sure.
Well, thanks for hanging out with us, Daniel.
Hey, my pleasure. This is great.
Thanks, man.
But thank you. Great questions. A few that I have not heard yet.
I appreciate you spending the time with me.
Hey, anytime, man. This was really fantastic.
Subscribe and follow. Links are in the show notes. You can find me at jeffccarter.com and hit the link to pick up my collection, We Bleed Orange and Black, 31 fun-sized tales for Halloween. Until next time, stay spooktacular.